What if the greatest threat to the international system is not chaos, but the quiet normalization of power exercised without consent? What if the danger is not the breakdown of order, but the growing belief that order no longer needs agreement, restraint, or shared legitimacy to survive? For decades, the world has been guided by a comforting story. A story that tells us stability flows from rules, that law restrains power, and that institutions exist to prevent the strong from acting purely on impulse. This story has shaped how governments explain their actions to citizens, how alliances justify loyalty, and how authority is defended on the global stage. It is a story designed to reassure. But beneath it lies a far more unsettling reality, one that is increasingly difficult to ignore. The unsettling question is this: what happens when the systems built to preserve order begin operating independently of the values that once justified them? When procedures continue, but purpose fades. When rules remain visible, but restraint disappears. We are taught to assume that legality equals legitimacy, that procedure guarantees justice, and that power channeled through formal institutions is automatically limited. History tells a more uncomfortable truth. Systems rarely collapse because rules are openly discarded. They weaken when rules are applied selectively. When law becomes a tool of convenience rather than a shared boundary. When enforcement replaces consent as the organizing principle of authority. At that stage, the language of governance does not vanish. It survives. Courts still convene. Institutions still release statements. Officials still speak in the vocabulary of norms, responsibility, and order. On the surface, everything looks familiar. Yet beneath that surface, something essential has shifted. Authority expands while restraint contracts. Power is exercised more frequently, more confidently, and with fewer justifications offered in advance. What was once described as extraordinary becomes acceptable. What was once controversial becomes routine. This is not how systems collapse in dramatic fashion. This is how they drift into instability. Instability, in this sense, does not announce itself with catastrophe. It emerges through normalization, through the gradual expansion of what is considered permissible, through the slow redrawing of boundaries around sovereignty, accountability, and jurisdiction. Once those boundaries move, they rarely move back. The question is no longer whether a particular action can be justified in isolation, but whether the framework that once made justification meaningful still exists. If power no longer requires broad consent, if legitimacy can be claimed after the fact, and if consequences are distributed unevenly, then the strain is not local or temporary. It is systemic. This is not a story about personalities or partisan politics. It is not about individual leaders or singular decisions. It is about structure, about a global order that may still appear solid on the surface while its foundations quietly shift beneath it. To understand why this moment matters, it is necessary to step back from individual events and examine the system as a whole. Global order is not sustained by power alone. It depends on shared expectations about limits, reciprocity, and predictability. When those expectations weaken, even the strongest actors find it harder to shape outcomes without triggering unintended consequences. At the systemic level, the issue is not legality versus illegality or morality versus immorality. It is coherence. A global system functions when rules are broadly accepted because they serve mutual interests, even when those interests are distributed unequally. When rules are perceived as instruments used selectively by those with the capacity to enforce them, the system does not collapse overnight. It fragments. States do not immediately rebel. Instead, they hedge. They adapt quietly. They diversify relationships, reduce exposure, and prepare for a future in which guarantees no longer hold. Economic stability is inseparable from this process. Markets are not abstract machines governed solely by supply and demand. They are confident structures. They rely on assumptions about continuity, about contracts being honored, borders being respected, and shocks being contained. When power actions blur legal and political boundaries, Uncertainty spreads far beyond the immediate actors involved. Energy markets reprice risk. Capital becomes cautious. Insurance costs rise. Investment horizons shorten. These changes are gradual and often invisible to the public, but they accumulate, reshaping the economic environment over time. Power relations also shift in subtle but enduring ways. Actions taken by dominant states are never evaluated in isolation. They are observed, studied, and internalized by others. When one actor demonstrates that exceptional measures are acceptable under certain narratives, others begin crafting their own narratives. Over time, restraint erodes not because norms are openly rejected, but because they are reinterpreted. The exception becomes the template. Alliances feel this pressure as well. Partnerships built on shared values strain when interests diverge under stress. Cooperation continues, but trust thins. Strategic alignment gives way to contingency planning. Unity may still be displayed, but its depth diminishes. Perhaps most critically, this moment speaks to the future of global governance itself. Institutions designed to manage conflict, regulate trade, and arbitrate disputes depend on a basic belief in their neutrality. When that belief weakens, institutions rarely collapse outright. Instead, they hollow out. They continue functioning procedurally while losing their capacity to constrain power. Decisions are still made, meetings still occur. But outcomes increasingly reflect power asymmetries rather than collective restraint. The long-term danger is not dramatic disorder. It is the normalization of exception. A world in which necessity is endlessly invoked, actions are justified after the fact, and stability becomes episodic rather than structural. In such an environment, crises are not resolved. They are postponed, displaced, and multiplied. Each unresolved tension feeds the next. Each precedent lowers the threshold for further action. This is why the issue extends far beyond any single country or decision. It touches the architecture of the global system itself, how authority is exercised, how economic confidence is sustained, and how power transitions are managed. Once these foundations weaken, rebuilding them becomes far more difficult than dismantling them ever was. To understand how the system arrived at this point, it is necessary to look not at a single turning point, but at a sequence of structural shifts layered over time. The present moment is the result of accumulated precedents, each one slightly expanding the boundaries of what power could justify. In the decades following the Cold War, the international system drifted away from balance toward uniformity. One governance model, one financial architecture, and one security framework came to dominate. Initially, this produced stability. Markets expanded, institutions multiplied. Conflicts appeared manageable, but beneath that apparent order, a transformation was underway. Enforcement increasingly replaced consent as the organizing principle of global relations. Sanctions became the default response to political disagreement. Financial systems were weaponized to achieve strategic aims. Diplomatic isolation replaced negotiation. Each step was defended as temporary, exceptional, or necessary. And each step reduced the cost of going further the next time. Over time, legal mechanisms once intended to resolve disputes were repurposed to exert pressure. Jurisdiction stretched beyond borders. Courts began functioning not only as arbiters of law, but as extensions of state power. What once required broad multilateral agreement could now be executed through unilateral interpretation. At the same time, economic stress accumulated. Globalization delivered growth, but also inequality, deindustrialization, and political resentment. As economic legitimacy weakened at home, foreign policy tools became more coercive abroad. Power was increasingly demonstrated rather than negotiated. The language of rules remained, but the practice shifted. Trust in multilateral institutions eroded as repeated crises exposed their limits. States began relying less on collective mechanisms and more on bilateral leverage. The system did not collapse. It fragmented. Crucially, none of this happened suddenly. Norms were not abandoned. They were stretched. Exceptions were justified. What once provoked controversy gradually became routine. This is how systems drift into instability. Through repetition, not rupture. Through decisions that feel pragmatic in the moment, but reshape the structure over time. Economic pressures sit at the core of this trajectory. Governments do not operate independently of debt levels, currencies, or access to capital. High public debt narrows policy options. Servicing it requires growth, low borrowing costs, and stable market access. When growth slows and interest rates rise, domestic adjustment becomes politically costly. External pressure begins to appear attractive. Sanctions, asset freezes, and legal claims promise leverage without immediate fiscal pain. Inflation compounds these dynamics. It erodes real incomes, weakens political legitimacy, and forces central banks into restrictive policies that slow economic activity. Governments under inflationary stress become less tolerant of uncertainty, especially in energy and commodity markets. Stability of supply becomes a strategic priority. Actions taken to secure it are framed as legal or security measures, but their roots are material. Trade and capital flows reinforce the pattern. The modern global economy depends on interconnected financial infrastructure, payment systems, insurance markets, shipping routes, and currency clearing. These are not neutral channels. They are points of control. When access becomes politicized, flows can be redirected without open conflict. Sanctions operate through this mechanism, but they also fragment markets, encourage parallel systems, and raise costs globally. Capital responds defensively, seeking predictability. Over time, repeated use of economic coercion reduces efficiency and increases systemic fragility. Energy sits at the center of this tension. It underpins industrial production, transportation, and daily life. Even perceived instability in energy access feeds inflation and political unrest. For producing states, resources provide leverage but also vulnerability. For importing states, dependence becomes a strategic risk. Capital reacts accordingly, demanding higher returns or withdrawing altogether. A feedback loop emerges. Economic pressure justifies coercive measures. Coercive measures increase uncertainty. Uncertainty deepens economic stress. Geography further shapes these outcomes. Control over sea lanes, access to energy basins, and influence near strategic corridors continue to matter. Military presence follows geography, creating commitments that are costly to reverse. Alliances distribute risk across space, but also multiply friction points. Institutional power amplifies influence, allowing actions to be framed as administrative rather than strategic. Yet this power depends on participation. When institutions are perceived as aligned with specific interests, legitimacy erodes and parallel systems emerge. The immediate effects of actions at this scale are rarely decisive. Governments, markets, and societies absorb the initial shock. The deeper consequences unfold later as systems adjust to new assumptions. Strategic space narrows. Risk pricing becomes chronic. Energy volatility feeds inflation. Citizens experience higher costs, reduced services, and diminished confidence in governance. These pressures accumulate unevenly, deepening inequality between states and within societies. Over time, stability becomes conditional rather than assumed. Growth continues, but more slowly and unevenly. Expectations lower. The system functions, but with reduced resilience. Looking ahead, several paths are possible. One involves recalibration, quiet reassertion of limits, renewed predictability, and partial restoration of confidence. Another involves ambiguity, where exceptions persist, parallel systems expand, and stability requires constant intervention. The most dangerous path accelerates normalization of exception, deepening fragmentation, economic warfare, and social strain. What determines the direction is not rhetoric, but incentives, whether cooperation still pays, whether restraint remains valuable, whether power continues to be costly when exercised without consent. Structural change rarely announces itself. It reveals itself through small shifts, pragmatic decisions, and adaptations made under pressure. Control may appear intact even as the foundations that support it thin. The modern global system was built on imperfect assumptions. That law could restrain power, that markets could remain insulated from politics, and that institutions could mediate conflict without becoming instruments of it. As these assumptions weaken, uncertainty spreads. What replaces them is not chaos, but a more complex and fragile order, one that relies on constant intervention rather than shared restraint. The question is no longer whether the world is changing. It is whether those navigating that change still recognize the limits of control and the cost of forgetting them.